What emotion do you associate with effort? Does effort feel energizing, draining, exciting, overwhelming? Maybe it's a mix of all these things depending on the day. Just really sit with that for a second. While you think about that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Elijah, but you can call me Lay. Welcome back to A Little Atypical, where we dive into all things wellness, personal development, and lifestyle topics. I like to approach typical topics from a not so typical perspective, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. So, this is actually the last episode of the month focused on effort, and I think it's fitting that we're ending on a lighter, more hopeful note. Because if you've been following along this January, you know we've been exploring this topic from different angles. So episode 71 explored the absence of effort leads to neediness and prevents self-efficiency, which essentially examined the relationship between effort, neediness, and self-sufficiency from both personal, identity, and cultural perspectives, while showing how misdirected effort creates emotional dependency, whereas genuine effort kind of fosters wholeness, to put it simply. Episode 73 challenged effortlessness culture and reframed effort as intentional investment in what genuinely matters. So showing that choosing care and showing up fully builds a life aligned with your true values. And I feel like those last episodes were on the heavier side, and I want this episode to be a bit more lighthearted while still being emotionally introspective. Because here's my belief: effort doesn't always have to feel heavy. When rooted in intention and aligned with who you actually are, it could be one of the most fulfilling experiences. So today I'm starting with a book I recently finished that surprisingly tied into this theme of effort perfectly. It wasn't even planned. I just happened to read it at the exact time that I would be covering this topic. The book is Safety Net by Deanna Grey, and I'm going to give a mini book review. Also, I don't want you to worry if you plan on reading it and want to avoid spoilers. So I'll have a section of this episode dedicated to healing your relationship with effort so you could form genuine happiness through it. I'll do my best to remember to include timestamps as well. So honestly, let's just dive right in. Safety Net by Deanna Grey. This book centers around two characters, Celeste and Lincoln Hill, and we meet both of these characters in the first book. First, I've got to say, if you're looking for a book that's more fast-paced excitement, this is probably not the book for you. But if you're like me and you love reading all books, but in this case, contemporary romance books, that explores deeper themes like personalities, specific identities, and how those dynamics influence relationships, then I would say this is definitely worth your time. Celeste has social anxiety disorder and Lincoln has ADHD. I don't think Lincoln's condition is explicitly mentioned right at the start, but if you've ever been friends with or dated someone with these experiences, you pick up on it instantly based on how the author wrote them. And honestly, Deanna Grey does an incredible job with neurodivergent representation across her books. Celeste hit really close to home for me. Social anxiety affects your life in so many ways. And one thing I think the author expresses really well is how much perfectionism plays into the experience. Celeste is incredibly talented, but she constantly, I would like to say, self-filters herself or edits herself in a way. Her social anxiety affects her so heavily that she had to drop college courses whenever presentations were required. And obviously, some professors were understanding and accommodating, but others weren't. And eventually her parents didn't want to support her financially anymore. In her case, the effort she had to take was getting out of her comfort zone and dealing with challenges of not only anxiety, but beliefs and behaviors she has that reflects perfectionism and people-pleasing tendencies. Her effort wasn't necessarily about her creative work, because it's clear she has this drive to create already, but putting her work out there, which is something I understand as someone who is a creative, still takes so much effort, but it's just different than what people expect. And just because that work isn't necessarily visible doesn't make it any less valuable. In addition to that, what I also appreciated is that it took time for Celeste to fall for Lincoln, and Lincoln was patient with her in terms of their dynamic. A person with social anxiety can absolutely have crushes on people they don't know well, but the physical and emotional intimacy, for some people that's just a different story. And the book captures how overwhelming and performative intimacy can feel when it's not rooted in genuine connection for some people, and how it can seem like a checklist of things to get through rather than something natural, which is exactly how the author puts it. And I feel like this is one of the understated things in relation to effort in relationships, because from my experience, and I kind of alluded to this in episode 71, that from the standpoint of having anxious tendencies in relationships, you tend to overthink the interactions just as much, especially when you haven't really worked through the perfectionism, the people pleasing, and in some cases, the control issues. And I should add, when I say control, I don't mean controlling the other person, because that would be more narcissistic. But I do think people with anxiety can sometimes have this desire to control what people think of them. And that carries into relationships, romantic relationships, to want their idealistic version of what a relationship in their head should be. And I'm not saying that's always the case, not everyone, but that can possibly sometimes be the case. That is another example of effort that is behind the scenes work. But anyways, not to get too off track, moving on to Lincoln, he shows how viewing yourself in a certain light, in his case as a failure or a quote-unquote lost cause, influences how seriously you take things. He has this outgoing personality that Celeste initially views as him being so comfortable around people, but as viewers or readers, whichever word you want to use, we see it's not what she thinks it is. And Celeste eventually realizes it too, which is so telling about perception bias, which in human fallacy is our subconscious tendency to interpret information, people, and situations subjectively, influenced by our existing beliefs, experiences, and expectations, honestly leading to distorted or oversimplified or just straight up inaccurate judgment instead of objective reality. So sometimes we view traits others have as better because we wish we could act that way. And in Celeste's case, she viewed his outgoing nature as being so grounded and easygoing that he could just be and talk to anyone and everyone. Like I said, we know Lincoln views his outgoing nature as a facade, a performance, a distraction to ignore what he's actually concerned about. He sees Celeste's quietness as authentic confidence, someone who doesn't have to, and this is from the book, run her mouth to be seen or heard. And like I said, eventually Celeste recognizes Lincoln buries himself just like she does. And in her words, he's just done it more successfully and with more grace. But that doesn't mean it makes him feel any less lonely. And there's this moment in the book that kind of really captures this. When Lincoln accidentally reveals something vulnerable about himself, the narration observed, and I'm quoting, "When I met Lincoln's gaze, I saw nerves there. He hadn't meant to share that tidbit. He wasn't using his failure as a setup for some punchline. His jaw tightened when he looked away from me and back to the tour guide, like he was finally interested in the information he'd digested a multitude of times." And this is such a telling moment because it showed how Lincoln's usual performance cracked, especially while he was around Celeste. You know, like typically, like I said, he kind of has like this class clown type of vibe. You know, the funny guy, the guy who, keeps people entertained. But at that moment, he wasn't using humor as a shield, he wasn't deflecting. He was genuinely uncomfortable because he's being seen in that moment. And then comes this like realization. I can't remember what page this was on, but it went, the strings between us strengthened because despite being opposites, we'd buried something similar. We were afraid of the same kind of failure and loneliness. So obviously, this is when she explicitly realizes and feels like their connection deepened, not because of surface similarities, but through shared fears and vulnerabilities. Both understand what it's like to fear putting in effort and having it not be enough. Celeste's perfectionism convinces her that her work will never meet her standards. Lincoln has already decided he'll fail before he fully commits. They recognize in each other the same paralysis. The terror of trying your hardest and still falling short. And this shared understanding of how fear blocks effort is what allows them to truly see each other, in my opinion. So, what's interesting, to go back to the quote about Celeste's perception of Lincoln burying himself, it's not that Lincoln hides his fear more successfully than Celeste. He just hides it in a way that society finds more acceptable. And don't hate me for this, but outgoing personalities are rewarded. We equate extroversion with confidence, social success, and having it all together. When Lincoln performs this version of himself, being, talkative, engaging, always on, people accept it without question. They don't see the loneliness underneath. But Celeste and her quietness, that gets questioned. That gets treated as a problem. That gets treated as something that needs to be fixed because humans are supposed to be social beings and interactions should be a natural instinct. So some people think. I think this is such an important distinction because it shows how we assign value to different coping mechanisms based on how well they fit into social norms. Lincoln's performance is exhausting for him in a sense, but it is rewarded by the world around him. Celeste's withdrawal is protective for her, but for so many people, they see it as a problem. And this actually reminded me of a crush I had a long time ago. He was this extremely outgoing person, and I think I was drawn to him because he fascinated me with how different he was from me. And when I say this, I mean he actively participated in classes, seemed like this very talkative person who always engaged with people around him, and he was very sporty, which wasn't something I was really used to growing up. Side note, I did activities sparingly as a kid, but never really stuck with anything long enough to develop real interest, partially because I moved a lot. Like, after kindergarten, my mom wanted to move to a southern state, but when we moved back, it was like halfway through, I believe it was like first grade, and we stayed in kind of like a multi-family generational household. And if you're a person of color, sometimes it's more common you live with your aunts, uncles, grandparents, etc. But the point of me saying this is it just wasn't common for me to really develop interest in that really includes sports. Even though I did certain things, like when I was younger, I took bass guitar lessons. I did karate, but I only got up to a purple belt before I had to kind of move around again. But the point is, I had a crush on this guy because he was so different from me. And I really couldn't get to know him because, as I said, I really related to Celeste, but with unfortunately even worse social skills, at least at the time. I think part of the crush was wanting to know him outside of his outgoingness because it did feel at times like he was doing certain things as a sense of validation. Like there was this kind of spark of loneliness underneath it all. Even the somewhat not good things he kind of did at the expense of me, I think now that I'm older and out of it, I could kind of interpret it in a different way. And I think I recognized that because I understood what it felt like to perform a version of yourself that people find acceptable, even when it doesn't feel like the whole truth. In my opinion, that's what Celeste sees in Lincoln. She recognizes that his outgoing nature isn't freedom, well, eventually, that it's another kind of cage. And that's what makes their connection so powerful, so interesting to see play out. They both see through each other's performances to the person underneath who's just trying to figure out how to exist in a world that doesn't always make space for who they actually are, you know? And essentially, they, even though I said like, oh, they're opposites, they're more alike than different. And now I want to share more quotes that illustrate how the book explicitly explores effort, and specifically with how fear blocks us from trying, how intentional effort transforms us, and ultimately how choosing to put in genuine effort leads to happiness and fulfillment. So, starting off with one theme, I want to talk about the fear that blocks effort. And this is the quote I chose. It's infuriating to watch, someone with so much talent and drive is getting in their own way simply because they can't see themselves clearly due to a warped perspective. Do you realize how fortunate you are to possess both talent and drive? I'd give anything to be able to do half of what you've done. Anything to be brave enough to give it my all. So this quote captures the tragedy of unused potential, not because Celeste lacks ability, but because fear has convinced her that her work will never be good enough. Lincoln is speaking to Celeste here, I believe. I think that's what I wrote in my notes. And is kind of like frustrated by her perfectionist tendencies and her impulse to endlessly re-edit her creation instead of sharing it with the world. What's fascinating about this moment is what Lincoln is calling out in Celeste is what he struggles with himself. He sees her talent and drive, qualities he, wishes he had, but he also recognizes that she's getting in her own way. And the irony is that while Celeste puts in the work but never feels like it's enough, Lincoln rarely gives things his full effort because he's decided he'll fail. And they're both trapped by fear, just in different ways. Lincoln is drawn to Celeste because she represents what he wishes he could be, someone who cares enough to try, but he also sees how that same drive can become self-sabotaging when perfectionism takes over. The fear of working hard and still not living up to expectations. That fear paralyzes us. Like, if you never really try, you can always tell yourself, well, I could have done it if I wanted to. But once you put in genuine effort, you have to face the possibility that your best might not be enough. And, that's terrifying. But this warped perspective around effort, whether it's avoiding it entirely or never being satisfied with it, is exactly what keeps both of them trapped. The very thing that they're both avoiding in their own ways is what would set them free. Now, on to quotes about shame, self-worth, and the avoidance of effort. So kind of following that theme. The first one I put down was this quote. I've never been properly introduced to embarrassment. I didn't understand the intricacies of this spiral of regret. Now that Celeste knew about my failure and had seen me trying to press forward without much explanation, I was anxious about what would come next and how could I shift her attention to something lighter and less about me. which is such an interesting line because it shows that he wants to engage, but he never wants to really engage with something deeply. And what followed was even more heartbreaking, and I think this one hits hard too, which is, if you want honesty, I'll let you know I didn't think I was worth it. I didn't think I'd make it this far. And here we see the root of Lincoln's avoidance. He didn't believe he was worth the effort. And this is so important to note because when you don't believe you're worth investing in, effort feels pointless. Why work hard for someone, yourself, who doesn't deserve it? And this belief system keeps us from trying and therefore keeps us from experiencing the happiness that comes from meaningful work. And the next quotes, I want to focus on how avoidance of effort affects our connections because I just found it really interesting. And I'm gonna go with both the platonic perspective and romantic. So Lincoln's friend Sam calls him out. You haven't even tried. You shut out all of us. You listened to a part of you led by fear instead of listening to the people who know that when Lincoln Hill puts his mind to something, it's game over. And from this quote, you can tell like his friends are frustrated, not because they don't care, but because they do. They see his potential and they want him to live his dreams, but they can't do the work for him. And moving on to the romantic perspective, which is going to lean more into accountability, which is Celeste is holding Lincoln accountable even when it's uncomfortable. And I feel like this dynamic is important to know as someone with social anxiety because it is very hard for you to stand up for yourself sometimes and have like that confrontation, especially when you're so used to people pleasing. When someone, especially someone with social anxiety, really cares about the connection and really wants you in their life, they are going to tell you how they feel. They are going to hold you accountable because not only do they see better for you, it's probably also that they want you in their lives, which means they want to deal with this issue so they don't resent you for it. But anyways, these are the quotes. I'm trying to hold you accountable for something you promised you would do. I don't think that's too much to ask. And later on she says, or I can't remember if this is a continuation, but this is how the quote goes. I'm not sure I want to be the person pulling you away when you could easily enjoy your night, the person waiting for you to remember a commitment. I'm not sure you want someone you have to keep an eye on, to constantly worry if I'm okay in the crowded room when that's the most natural thing for most people. That's an honest feeling. Like sometimes, especially when you're with some people, as a socially anxious person, the mindset is leaning more towards like, oh, I don't want to be a burden on you because you're the only one in this room I'm comfortable with, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't go have your fun, explore, whatever, interact with other people. And sometimes you have like this guilt too, but I digress on that one. Moving on, she also realizes I couldn't get him to take the right thing seriously if he wasn't ready yet. And then later on, we're in a similar section. And I think this is a line she says directly to him and not just her internal dialogue like the last one. All I'm saying is maybe it's time to do what you say you want to do. Be responsible. Find some sort of balance. Stop treating everything like some game, especially when someone wants to trust you with something important and special to them. I want to add that some of these things can sound harsh on the outside, and for the person being on the receiving end of it, it could just feel like a lot, like you're getting attacked. But both perspectives show how avoidance of effort doesn't just affect us. It affects everyone who cares about us, whether it's friends or romantic partners. People who love us want what's best for us. they want us to become who we say we want to be. But the thing is, we often view accountability as harsh or unsupportive because we wrap ourselves in guilt and shame from letting others down. And when someone calls us out, it feels like an attack rather than an act of care. The truth is, accountability is an expression of care. Sam's frustration with Lincoln isn't about judgment, it's about caring enough to refuse to watch him waste his potential. Celeste's willingness to speak up despite her social anxiety shows her own growth in choosing meaningful effort over comfort. And she's not nagging him, she's refusing to enable his avoidance. And that level of accountability is necessary in genuine connections. People who truly care about you won't just cheer you on when you're doing well, they'll also hold up a mirror when you're getting in your own way. And yes, it's uncomfortable, but it's also what separates surface level relationships from the ones that actually helps you grow. And then there's also this moment of effort creates connection when Lincoln says to Celeste, and this is a whole different section, but I just really love this part. And I believe it was the part where they were celebrating Celeste's play about to be put on. And he says, I'd wait till the sun burned out for a simple response because you are one of the most genuine people I've met. You think your quiet is a flaw when all I see is a person who doesn't put on a mask to entertain people. So many people make noise, but you, Celeste, know how to build something in the silence. And that's something he says to her. And why I love it is because in this world, there is so much noise, right? And what he's essentially saying is that she doesn't have to contribute to that noise. She doesn't have to perform for other people. She can be silent and just let things speak for themselves instead of always trying to convince people why she's worth it. In another moment, Celeste, I forgot, I really should have wrote down the pages, but this was a quote I love too. The shy side of Lincoln came out when he felt safe and comfortable. I love that we were opposite in that way. I was honored that I was the person he could be shy around. Again, this very much shows the dynamic of someone who is socially anxious versus not. As someone who is socially anxious, because when you are comfortable with someone, you want to be talkative. You want to be vocal. You're not afraid to share what you think. That is something so interesting now. And obviously, I don't mean that for everyone. It's not a general blanket statement. Obviously, people with different family dynamics, different other key traits, experiences and environments will feel differently. But I'm solely talking from my observation. And overall, this dynamic shows how genuine effort in relationships, the effort to really see and accept someone, and the effort to hold them accountable creates space for authentic connection. They put in the effort to understand each other beyond their performances, and that effort creates happiness for both of them. And now we get into the quotes that kind of highlight the reality of effort. So when Lincoln finally starts trying, he says, is this how it always is? Working hard for something, truly wanting it, is draining. And I think that's when he was basically training so to take his hockey playing more seriously. And I'm not sure if this following quote was right after that, but Sam's response cuts to the heart of our instant gratification culture. He says, you want to fix something you've messed up over the course of months in a matter of days. You want results right after you've made the decision. You're conflating instantaneous gratification with right. And then he says, you can't rush this, Lincoln. You can't talk your way out of it. You can't cram all the work in the night before. This is your problem. You think once you decide something, the stars will align. That's never how life worked. Grow up. These quotes reveal an important truth. Real effort is draining. It is hard, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. And a lot of times, effort, doing the thing, is about the long term outcome, not the short term. The exhaustion Lincoln feels isn't a sign he should quit, it's a sign he's finally engaging with something real. And the happiness that comes from effort isn't about the work being easy, it's about the work being meaningful. And that is why you keep showing up. And now we get to like towards, I think, the end of the book. So these quotes are going to be focused on transformation when effort becomes essentially freedom. And this is where everything shifts. So at the end, Lincoln begins to change his relationship with effort, as shown in the quote. Developing a decent plan took hours. I sat on the ground in my room, putting everything I hoped to achieve in life on blue lines of paper. I avoided fear the best I could because after a few hours of writing, I realized somewhere along the line, wanting things had become embarrassing, almost shameful, because what lost cause dared to want? And this moment is so powerful because it names the shame that keeps us from trying. How many of us felt like wanting things is embarrassing? Like we're not allowed to have dreams because we've failed before. But Lincoln pushes through that shame and keeps writing. And that's the effort that changes everything. And then comes this realization, because this is also in that part of the book. But if I'd learned anything from being with Celeste, it was that even with all the uncertainty and doubt, trying was better than standing still. Seeing the plan laid out before felt like stepping on solid ground after being at sea for years. And here's where we see the happiness kind of emerge, like not from achieving the goal yet, but from effort itself, from choosing to try. The act of planning, of putting his hopes on paper, of committing to intentional action, that's what creates the feeling of solid ground. And that's what brings relief and hope. And he continues, as I wrote this out, I wondered if it was okay if my end goal wasn't fully figured out yet, or if it would naturally fall into place. But trying to improve doesn't come naturally, so I figured, why would my purpose? Even naturally gifted, brilliant people had to wake up every day and get to work. Celeste, with all her talent, kindness, and strength, still worked for it. And this realization that transformed his relationship with effort, that even talented people have to put in the work. Effort isn't a sign of inadequacy. It's how everyone grows. One of the main reasons people give up on things so quickly is because they believe others are just quote unquote naturally talented, and they let that belief destroy their willingness to pursue anything that doesn't come easily. But seeing how dedicated Celeste was shows Lincoln that effort is a sign of commitment to yourself, not proof that you're not good enough. Talent without effort means nothing. Effort itself is what builds the life you want, no matter who you are. And this line, when I discovered all the things I believed would keep me trapped were actually the keys to setting me free. And this line perfectly captures the paradox of effort and happiness. The very thing he was avoiding, which was like structure, commitment, consistent work, were the things that would help him feel free. The effort he feared would trap him actually made him feel more grounded and liberated. Next quote is, reflecting effort doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. And this quote, I'm pretty sure, is from Celeste's perspective. So it says, I'd gone through 5 stages of grief, settling into acceptance when I decided to register for the fall semester with just 6 credits and a new job to help pay for them. It wasn't the dream, but it was a step in the right direction, an independent direction. This shows that effort doesn't have to be all or nothing. Sometimes happiness comes from just taking the next step, even when it's smaller than you hoped. The pride Celeste feels isn't from achieving perfection. It's from choosing to move forward despite uncertainty, even after her parents cut her off financially and she was still waiting to hear back from her dream internship. And the final quote I want to share is reflecting the joy of sharing your work and that effort, because I think just sharing how it paid off is so important. This is something Lincoln says to her after she gets her phone call back from the dream job. "How does it feel?" he asked, brushing tears off my cheeks. "To know your work matters. Your hero loves it." And those tears of joy was because her effort paid off, not in external validation alone, but in the courage it took to finally share her work. The plays she wrote years ago, but finally had the courage to share with the world, represents the accumulation of her own journey with effort. For someone with social anxiety, putting your creative work out there is an act of vulnerability and bravery. The happiness she experiences come from choosing to try despite, and I did do a podcast on that, specifically despite her fear, from putting in the effort to create something meaningful, and then the additional effort to kind of go against what someone advised her to share it anyways. And that's where genuine fulfillment lives, not in avoiding the hard things, but in choosing to engage with them anyway. So that is all for our little book review. If you're interested in reading it, I highly recommend it. But if you want to skip the book and just focus on how to heal your own relationship with effort, just stick around for the next section. So whether you plan to read the book or not, I wanted to spend some time talking about the lessons we can take from it and from our own lives about effort without the spoilers of the book review. So lesson 1 is chosen effort versus forced effort. The first thing to heal your relationship with effort so you can find joy through it is understand the difference between chosen effort and forced effort. Chosen effort energizes you. It's effort you're putting in because you genuinely want to, because it aligns with your values, your goals, your sense of who you want to become. It might be hard, but it feels meaningful. Forced effort, on the other hand, depletes you. It's effort you're putting in because you feel like you should, because someone else expects it, or because you're trying to meet some external standard that doesn't actually resonate with you. Most of us resist effort in friendships, relationships, appearances, and goals, not because we're lazy, but because the effort feels imposed rather than chosen. When you feel pressure to put in effort, your brain treats it as a threat. It becomes something to avoid. But when you choose to put in effort, when it comes from you, it becomes an act of self-respect and intentionality. Lesson 2, reframing forced effort. Now, I know not all effort feels like a choice, or you can do as a choice. Sometimes you have to do things you don't want to, but even in those situations, you can shift how you think about it. If you can avoid effort that feels forced, try viewing it as a stepping stone to something purposeful for you, a skill that will help you later, a necessary step toward a bigger goal. For example, maybe you hate your current job, but you need the income to save for something you actually care about. That reframe from "I'm stuck here" to "this is funding my next chapter" can make a huge difference in how the effort feels. Lesson 3, focus on intrinsic benefits and not external validation. So this one is a huge one. In general, focus on the process by finding benefits outside external validation or external motivation. Yes, external reasons can get the initial process going. If you want to impress someone, earn recognition, or hit a milestone, that can be enough to start. But it's typically not enough to overcome times that require patience or to continue momentum after you receive that external thing. Because the allure of getting the thing you initially wanted wears off as it becomes your new normal. If your only motivation is external, you'll lose steam once you get what you were chasing. But when you choose to put effort into yourself and your life, not for external validation, but because it aligns with who you are, that builds genuine happiness and self-respect. Effort, in this sense, is essentially a design concept. Whether you're more analytical, creative, spiritual, or scientific, One thing we all can understand to some degree is design, because design requires a process and intentional interaction. And in regards to life and living, that process is effort. Lesson 4. Effort is about the long term, not the immediate. We live in a culture that demands instant results, but real growth, real change, real fulfillment, that takes time. The book said it the most perfectly. You want to fix something you've messed up over a course of months in a matter of days. You're conflating instantaneous gratification with right. The timeline you're on is not a reflection of your worth. Progress is still progress even when it's slow. And I know how basic that sounds. But lesson 5, and this is going to be the final lesson, is redefine effort as intentional action. So stop thinking of effort as hard work in the hustle culture sense. Instead, think of it as intentional action. Effort rooted in personal values and authentic desires creates lasting satisfaction. It's not about doing more, it's about doing what matters. When you know why you're putting in effort, the work becomes meaningful. That's the connection between intentionality and effort. That's what transforms effort from something draining to something fulfilling. And understanding these lessons is the difference between exhausting yourself and building a fulfilling life. You're building something that actually matters to you. Happiness rooted in intentional effort is sustainable. It doesn't disappear when the novelty fades or external validation stops. It stays because it's built on your values, your choices, your purpose. And this is why people who quote unquote have it all can feel empty, like their efforts went towards what they thought they should want. And that is also why people with less can feel actually happy, because the effort they put in aligns with who they truly are. And these lessons isn't just about making effort easier. They're about building a life where the work you put in actually reflects the person you want to be. That is how you can become happy in this process, which is why I want to highlight this episode. And honestly, the overall theme of the month isn't about doing enough. The feeling of inadequacy usually stems from either not pursuing what you actually want or treating your desires as secondary because of others' expectations. The truth is, there's no single right way to live. Life is constantly changing. Technology evolves, cultural values shift, and what society puts on a pedestal today will transform tomorrow. Your only reliable compass is you, your intentions, your values, your beliefs. Effort is what allows you to recognize those intentions and transform your life from something that happens to you into something you actively create. Being a parent is work, building friendships is work, facing your trauma is work. In my perspective, what isn't work? The question isn't whether you should put in effort, it's whether the effort you're putting in is yours. Are you doing this because you genuinely want to or because you think you should? If the effort feels like pressure, that's your sign to reclaim agency. Ask yourself, what do I actually want? What kind of life do I want to create? Then give yourself permission to care about that answer, to try, to put in effort towards it, even if it's messy or imperfect. You are allowed to want things. You are allowed to put in effort towards the life you actually want and not life other people think you should have. Effort is one of the most powerful acts of self-love you can engage with, because it says, I matter, my dreams matter, and I'm willing to invest in that. So wherever you are, whether you're just starting out in the messy middle, like myself, or just feeling discouraged, you're doing it right. Effort isn't perfection. It's about showing up and taking the next step, even without the whole path mapped out. Remember the line, trying was better than standing still. So keep choosing, keep showing up for yourself, because when intention meets action, that's when happiness emerges. That's when you start building a life that actually feels like yours. So that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Before I close out, I'm not really going to give an update because I feel like it will tie into the next episode more, but I am still doing a card pull. Remember, if card readings are not your thing or not something you personally align with, but you still like other aspects of my content, thank you for listening this far. Be sure to come back Thursday and follow the podcast to stay up to date about new releases. So for this reading, I am using the Animal Spirit deck, and we got the Hummingbird, which is an air element. The booklet says, Hummingbird, positive, enthusiastic, spiritually resourceful. Inside the tiny hummingbird resides an endless well of energy and positivity. The hummingbird's secret is that it has learned where to gather nectar, and it returns to these sources daily for nourishment and rejuvenation. This sacred elixir springs from many sources, but usually involves nature, creativity, and exploring spirituality. Follow the way of the hummingbird and you cannot go wrong. Every droplet of life becomes sweet, every moment worth savoring. When in balance, smart, curious, loves to learn. When out of balance, pushy, insistent, sharp. To bring into balance, take a class. You're probably asking, why did we get this for today's episode? The hummingbird's wisdom connects to everything we've explored about intentional effort. The hummingbird returns to the same flowers daily because it knows that's where nourishment lives. This mirrors what happens when we discover joy in our effort. We naturally want to keep showing up. When work feels sweet instead of draining, you don't need to force yourself. The hummingbird teaches us that consistency isn't about grinding through motivation. It's about creating a relationship with your work where showing up becomes something you want to do. Just as a hummingbird has multiple nectar sources, we can infuse joy into our efforts in creative ways. For example, if studying indoors drains you, take your notes outside. Turn it into a picnic. Make it feel like your thing instead of something imposed on you. When you get creative about how you approach your work, when you make it meaningful in your own way, the effort transforms from draining to energizing. And to recap the line that says, every droplet of life becomes sweet, every moment worth savoring. This captures the essence of intentional versus forced effort. When you're choosing your path, even small steps matter. They're not boxes to check off. They're part of something you genuinely care about. Also, the card suggests take a class, but the deeper message behind this is learn how to make effort enjoyable. Find people interested in the same things, seek perspectives that expand your understanding, work with what you have while reaching for what you need. Because essentially the hummingbird doesn't force itself to drink from flowers it doesn't want. It finds what truly nourishes them and returns with joy. That's a relationship with effort we're all building. And with that being said, this is your homework for the episode. Think of one area in your life where effort feels heavy right now. Maybe it's your appearance, a relationship, a goal you're working towards, or even showing up socially. Now ask yourself, am I choosing this or am I being pressured into this? If it's pressure, what would it look like to either release this entirely or find a way to make it feel like your choice? What would change if you approach this from genuine intention rather than obligation? And that's all for today. Thank you for tuning into today's episode of A Little Atypical. If you found this helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share with someone who might need to hear this message. Remember to view the description box where you can find important links, such as the one to my website where there's so much more bonus content, and the one to my Substack where I am hoping to engage a lot more again this year. So until next time, have a good day, evening, or night, and stay authentically atypical. Okay, bye!